Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And here's a very cool welcome on a rather warm evening. Thank you for being here. On behalf of the Victoria Memorial Hall and the Calcutta Debating Circle, we are looking forward to an almost unprecedented talk. Stephen smirks, but that's how we are looking at it. And we're absolutely certain that that will be more than fulfilled. I now invite the Secretary and the Curator of the Victoria Memorial Hall, Dr. Jayanto Sengupta, to give the welcome address.
Good evening, everybody, and indeed a cool welcome to this evening's lecture by Dr. Stephen Kennedy on classics, why it matters. We in the Victoria Memorial Hall have been privileged to collaborate with the Calcutta Debating Circle over the past few years to co-host some top quality lectures, debates and discussions, and tonight is one more instance of this. So we are once again very thankful to CDC and especially to Dr. Kunal Sarkar, my friend, for providing yet another opportunity to collaborate. And it's a great honor to have with us as a speaker tonight, Dr. Stephen Kennedy, Head of Classics at the famed Harrow School in Middlesex, UK, whose stellar alumni include, among many others, people from Winston Churchill to Jawaharlal Nehru to Rusi Modi to Benedict Cumberbatch, and we especially welcome the group from Harrow School to Kolkata, and I'm sure all of them will be added in due course to that constellation. As you know, classics is a wide-ranging corpus of the literature, history, philosophy, languages, and archaeology of the ancient Greek and Roman worlds. Especially the two languages, Greek and Latin, have been used for generations to educate the elites of the Western world, in the hope that this would be able to produce more cultivated and creative individuals. Today, at a time when Greece and Rome are no longer seen as the pinnacles of civilization and refinement, at a time when the old emphasis on the preeminence of what is described as Western civilization, within quotation marks, is being replaced by a new emphasis on global history and worldwide interconnections. And finally, at a time when concentration spans are going down at the speed of light, this is the age of Snapchat and Instagram. In this age, do classics matter anymore? Dr. Stephen Kennedy's answer is an emphatic yes, and he is going to tell us tonight why it matters. Dr. Stephen Kennedy received his PhD in classical philosophy from the University of Exeter. He has been teaching the classics for over a decade in schools in the UK and works closely with the charity Classics for All to bring in the study of classics to state primary and secondary schools. He believes every student deserves to benefit from the learning, enjoyment, and inspiration that classics provide. And that belief, I'm sure, transcends national boundaries and rings a bell across the board in this room, which has many, many people, many, many educators. So that's all I have to say for now. Like all of you, I'm looking forward to a fascinating lecture. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Kennedy.
May I request you both gentlemen to be here? Yes. And for Dr. Sengupta to do the customary, yes, the honors, to remember us by with. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you. Thank you. Just a few words about CDC. For those of you who've heard them more than once, my apologies. But otherwise, it's obviously the Calcutta Debating Circle trying to promote debating and public speaking for almost a decade now. It's populated, as the men of CDC say, these are not my words. The men of CDC say that they came into this because they were allowed neither by their teachers nor by their wives to speak anywhere. And so CDC came to be. But as the lone woman on board, my teachers were much too kind to me. I was allowed to speak, and my husband had enough sense to run away while there was time. So here we are, a bunch of people, professionals who are trying to do our little bit. Since there are a lot of educators in this room, it's time that CDC somewhat commits itself, and we do today, to have some kind of a training program for teachers in schools. We have Sean Dolan with us here today, who's the debating coach at Harrow. And that's how these, Sean, could you please stand up and say hi to them? Yes, yes. That's Sean for you. So it's important. Oh, look at his boys who find it funny, is it? No, and that's the reason we've done well enough without our debating coaches, but yes, it's time that we develop these skills, and we'll probably use Sean for that. Thank you, Sean. I would now like to invite the Managing Trustee of CDC, Dr. Kunal Sharkar, to introduce Dr. Kennedy and the talk.
Swati, thanks very much. I think we better get on with things. You see, Harrow has always been very close to me because that was exactly the bus stop where I took a bus for a good part of 2.5 years when I was serving a hospital sentence somewhere in the northwest of London, right? And I used to see, rather smart-looking boys in funny-looking hats crossing the road. And after a few weeks, it dawned on me that this was a school, right? And the curiosity about Harrow grew. Myself and Stephen has been in communication to get this off the ground, I think roughly the same time as Brexit started, right? And there are a couple of reasons why this negotiations came to a fruition. And the reasons were, I think, twofold. One is we wanted to beat Brexit to it. And number two was, in our many rounds of discussions, we went through almost all the pubs, all the tea rooms, and all the eateries. And once we were going through the second round, we said, look, enough is enough. We've contributed enough to the local economy of Harrow. So it's time that we fixed up the dates and got our act together, and Harrow had to come to London. So, Joyanto, when you introduced the sort of famous alumni of Harrow, Harrow is otherwise introduced as the school where David Cameron and Boris Johnson did not study, right? So, as Brexit becomes more and more murkier, the Harrovians have a wry smile and say, don't blame us for it. It's the other school down the way who's got ourselves into this mess. I don't know what that other school is called, right. We expect to have them shortly, so I won't name them at the moment. Right? Stephen, that's the deal. Now, it's been very fulfilling, and I'm sure Stephen will absolutely mesmerize us. And being a little bit statistically minded, I think he's almost the first non-geriatric person I've come across who's so deeply interested in classics, right? So I can't think of a second person of his age. When the first day we had met and he said, my subject of persuasion is classics, I thought it must be classical music or something. I thought. I probably misheard him. In subsequent meetings, I ensured that we hadn't. And it's Stephen Kennedy for you this evening. It's been extremely gratifying for CDC, worth all the efforts we've put in. And Stephen, do classics matter? The stage is yours.
Right, well, thank you very much for coming. This is the title of my talk, Classics, Why It Matters. I'll give you a little bit of background very briefly on myself, and then I'll get into the lecture. I'm actually not a classicist by training originally. In fact, I did my first degree in mathematics. And maths was the way into classics for me, which is often opposite for many others. I read mathematics at Waterloo in Canada. You can probably tell from my accent I'm not British. After about 2.5 years of mathematics training, I discovered Plato at a Philosophy 101 class, and when I went to the library, all the copies of the Republic were taken out. And when I got the Loeb edition of Plato's Republic off the shelf, I discovered on the left-hand side of the book, everything was in Greek. I'd never seen Greek before in my life. And that was my introduction to classics. I was mesmerized by it. So after I finished my mathematics degree, in fact, I went back to university for a master's degree in classics and learned the languages from scratch at the age of 23 and did my master's in a year and a half. And then from that, I went to do a PhD in classics as well. So for me, I'm a convert, and I'm hoping to convert some of you this evening as well. But before I get into my lecture, I'd like, first of all, to extend my thanks on behalf of all the boys from Harrow and myself and from Sean to the Kolkata Debating Circle, and particularly Dr. Sarkar, to whom we are very grateful for inviting us to Kolkata, which for many of us will be our first time to India. I'd also like to thank the BSS School, who hosted us so generously today for our first debate. And over the course of the week, I'd also like to thank in advance La Martiniere School, the Future Hope School, the Adamas School, and the Newton School for all that they're going to do. Hosting us and the debates, we felt so welcome. Right, on to my lecture. So my lecture this evening is on why classics matter, and I'll try to explain, first of all, what the classics are, at least to me, what they involve, and put forward my considerable reasons, I think, why this particular discipline still matters today, and why it ought to be an important part of every student's curriculum. I'm going to offer a few examples of the beauty and the depth of the subject, and I'll hopefully close with an encomium and exhortation to you all in order to pursue it. Now, the study of classics has a very long legacy in Europe. It includes the study of the Greek poet Homer, and therefore is arguably the oldest academic subject in the West, as well as its oldest art form. The Greeks wouldn't have used the term classics as we understand it now. Our modern term classics is in fact derived from a late adjective in Latin, classicus, which was a term originally used to describe members of the highest class in Rome. By the 2nd century AD, the word evolved to be used only of literary criticism to describe authors that were of the highest quality. We know this from Aulus Gellius, a late Roman author, in his work Attic Nights, who contrasts the adjective classicus with the rather run-of-the-mill term he calls proletarius. The actual Latin that he writes is classicus assiduusque aliquis scriptor, non proletarius. The English translation for that is a writer of the first rank and not of the usual kind. So when we talk about the classics in the Western canon, we're talking about the best literature that's been produced by the best authors over nearly 1,300 years of civilization. The term classics slowly evolved over through to the 6th century AD, when the word had again evolved to acquire a distinct secondary meaning, which particularly referred to pupils who studied at school these classical authors. So these were the high classical authors, the high quality works, which became a core part of every student's education. Those were the first classicists that we know of. And this is how the two modern meanings of the word developed, which now refer both to literature and the standard text, which are used as a part of a student's curriculum. Although considered a single subject, I'm the head of classics, that they in fact encompass an enormous number of subdisciplines, as well as, but not limited to, the studies of the languages of Rome and Greece, which is to say Latin and classical Greek, but it also encompasses philosophy, history, art, architecture, religious studies, numismatics, which is the study of coins, epigraphy, which is the study of inscriptions, as well as archaeology, art history, and most recently in the 20th century, classics developed its own subdiscipline called reception studies, which is in fact a meta-discipline that classics now studies how classicists study classics. It's a strange discipline, but it's incredibly popular. And even with all this huge, enormous range, the breadth of classics, I'm going to argue this evening that it is the most important of all of the humanities. Let's go back to the beginning and start, as with all things in the classical world, with Homer. It's hard for us to imagine today, but we really ought not to forget the fact that classical Greek, the poet Homer, famous for the Iliad and the Odyssey, was a classical work, even to the classical Greeks. In the in the cultural high water of the 5th century BC Athens, Homer was considered a single author of the two largest poetic works, which were both taught to all students in classical Athens. But he was ancient, even by contemporary standards. Modern scholarship has now gone on to show that, in fact, the single man Homer was a collective and not an individual genius. We call Homer, but really what it is a wide collection of poets who've composed oral compositions over several centuries, and these compositions were then further refined over a course of many generations, which lay about 300 years before its loose canonization, so the form that we have it in now, not until the late 6th and early 5th century Athens. And all I mean to say by that is that Homer was considered the first work of classics, which had an almost divine status for all the great writers of Greece. So to the historians Herodotus and Thucydides, to the poets Pindar and Archilochus, the playwrights Aristophanes, Aeschylus, the philosophers Plato, and Socrates, Homer was a classical work that inspired an enormous outpouring of creative energies and a genuine spirit of rational intellectual curiosity of the world, which flourished in the great city of Athens. For the Greeks, the two classical poems by Homer contained everything that you needed to know: how to speak well in public. And for those of you who know the poems, you can imagine all the meetings of the Argives on the beaches just in front of Troy, when the great kings of Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Achilles come forward to speak with winged words or with honeyed words. With a beautiful description of Odysseus' speech, Homer describes him as speaking in such a way that his words fell upon the ears of his listeners like snow falling upon the earth. Homer talks of courage and of cowardice, of sacrifice and honor. He talks of kleos, glory, the shame of Helen and of Paris, the arrogance of Diomedes, the sorrow of Andromache and Priam. And of course, he starts with the wrath of Achilles. Homer covers every human emotion and action. There's death and birth, generalship and oarsmanship, kings and paupers, city dwellers and farmers. For the Greeks, there was nothing that was not contained in this classical work. Plato, the great philosopher, quoted Homer freely and nearly everywhere in his philosophical works. Homer is a work of classics that was known by every educated freeborn male in Greece. Plato even went as far as to say that Homer was the poet who had educated Greece. In turn, and in the passage of time, all those authors I just mentioned, the historians, the poets, the playwrights, the philosophers, even more authors I haven't mentioned, and even authors we don't even know because the works didn't survive in the ages, they themselves in turn became classical works, definitive texts that were continuously studied by every later generation. Plato dies around 347 BC, Aristotle after him. Alexander the Great carried Homer into battle in his conquest of Persia. At the same time, there were those developing Neoplatonists and Stoics and poets like Theocritus and the Alexandrian Greeks, who around the mid-3rd century turned the study of Homer into the first profession, our first examples of classical Greek classicists, as we know the term now. They wrote critical works of the poet, they established the text, and they aimed at their accurate transmission. It was remarkable that Homer's Greek finally became so antiquated that the Greeks themselves needed a dictionary, and just like we do with Shakespeare today. The Roman conquests of Greece in the mid-2nd century led to the widespread adoption of Greek culture in the West. That's for better or for worse. The Romans had their own very sparse literature in their authors of Plautus and Varro and the elder Cato, but it remained a staple of an educated Roman to study Greek, particularly Homer, as well as all the other Greek classics like Plato, Thucydides, and Aristotle. Cicero, the great Roman orator, jurist, and philosopher, studied Greek philosophy as an important branch of a liberal education, what the Romans called liberales artes, the education what becomes a free man. He also studied Homer, Hesiod, and all of the Greek poets, and quoted them as well freely, both to adorn his literary works, as well as for the sake of appearance of education. You weren't educated if you didn't know the classics. He saw the study of classics as a necessary help in order to realize his ambition of becoming a perfect orator. And through his entire life, the practice of his philosophy and their philosophy was his greatest joy and delight. He translated many works of Greek literature into the Roman language, Latin, for his fellow countrymen. They couldn't read Greek, and yet he thought it the most important thing to do for his country was to produce a Latin copy of Homer. Cicero's entire education was what we would recognize as in the classics. He translated very widely from Greek into Latin, so much so that he once remarked to his friend Atticus in a letter, he wasn't sure whether he had read more Greek or written more Latin. And I'll speak more about the act of translation later. But the study of Greek, at least to Cicero, imparted two very important lessons. First, he learned from the best debaters in the ancient world. He studied Demosthenes and Isocrates and Lysias. He picked up their techniques, and through his own translation of their works, he was both able to imitate their style or as well develop better